Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the technique shielding hammer and some of the more important principles, rules, theories, concepts, and strategies of this technique. So rather than starting up with the strategy like we normally do, let's talk about one of the themes of this technique, a theme of Kenpo, major theme of Kenpo, economy of motion. And let's talk about how it can be manifested here in its various ways in which we can do it. So let's start out with the base part of this technique. This is off a left roundhouse punch, and what I'm going to be doing is rule number one, establishing that base, and then blocking. And we're going to be creating that plus X, like we normally do. But here's where things start getting interesting. Let's talk about the economy of motion part here. So we have what's called an outer rim. The outer rim starts from our eyebrows up here, goes out to our shoulders and down to our groin. So think of it as this oval that's in front of our body, and that's where we want to stay. We want to defend ourselves because that's where all of our vital weapons are. Our targets are. So what happens if I don't do that? Let's say I reach out my outer rim to do this block. Well, let's start out from a defensive and an offensive standpoint. From a defensive standpoint, we're blocking a minor. We're not blocking a major. So what's left is that major. By me now trying to defend against that with that same arm, what have I done by going outside my outer rim? Well, I have created more distance for me to move and travel before I can make contact with that backup weapon. So that's a bad thing there. How about from an offensive perspective? Well, if I reach outside this outer rim, notice I've also elongated the amount of path I have here in order to get to my follow-up strike, which gives him more time to defend against him. And the third point of view, let's talk about this extremity and how it's trying to be kept as part of our body. If I reach outside here, what have I done? I've exposed that extremity to my opponent. Keep in mind the concept of blocks are positions of opportunity. So in other words, you recognize that you can use this against the opponent and then take advantage of it. So in this case, when I do this block outside, the opponent recognizes that I haven't kept my arm as part of my body and exposed it and allowed them to be able to get to it. Okay, so enough of that first part. Let's move on to the next part. So what's happening here? So what I want to do here is I want to follow up with this hit to this opponent. Okay. This brings in a concept of circular rotation. So let's describe what circular rotation is. Circular rotation is multiple circles working together. So in this case, I have my body, which is rotating. I have my shoulder, which is rotating. And I have my wrist or my hand in order to rotate my strike across the opponent. So all three of these weapons, or circles together, work together in order to create that strike to the opponent. So all sounds good. But let's talk about some stuff that can happen in there with economy of motion. Well, first of all, our backup weapon or strike is going to be this elbow. So what we want to do is we want to drop down and settle into that. We'll get more into that as we go forward. So what I don't want to do is strike, rise up, and then drop down. What I want to do is rise up all at once and then drop. Economy of motion. Don't want to make a separate motion. The next thing I want to think about is what's going to be happening with this strike after I make that strike. What I don't want to do is continue the rotation in order to try and hit the opponent with the elbow. Why? Again, we're allowing them to get defensive against us. And in this case, what we've done is we created a pass line. Because of the fact that I've exposed myself and closed off my center line to my opponent, they can now prevent me from following up the weapon. So what do I do instead? So what I do is I do something that's considered ratchet-like. So a true ratchet is if I were to bring my hand out and then drop my elbow, that's a true ratchet. The original point stays in its place. But what we're going to do is ratchet-like. Why is it ratchet-like? Because of the fact that I'm doing an elbow. And we should all know that for elbows and knees, what we want to do is create a compact unit. So what does that mean? It means I want to not leave my hand loose. What I want to do is I want to compact it so that when I get the strike, the opponent feels the full brunt of it, and it's not a loose weapon. So why does that make it ratchet-like? Because of the fact that my hand doesn't really stay exactly where it is. It actually bends a little bit before I do the strike. So let's talk through this last strike here. So let's talk through some of the things that can happen here based upon what happens with our opponent. So if we were to have this weapon come in as we do this strike, I would have to turn an offense into a defense. So this brings in compacting circles or contracting circles and expanding circles. So in other words, if he didn't throw, this, which is the ideal phase, I can just go right in here and expand my circle and get into the strike. But what happens if he does throw it? Well, I have to contract the circle and turn that offense into a defense and then continue with that elbow. But notice what happened with their body. There's a different alignment here. So what he's done is he created a brace angle by us being facing me perfectly square on, as opposed to if he didn't, he would have a change. So what does that mean to me? So what that means to me is what's going to happen with the follow-up with this opponent. If I do this strike and I just drop it down, you'll notice that he's not moving very much. But what happens if he didn't do that? Well, what I can do is I can take advantage of what's called the zero depth zone. So what is the zero depth zone? If you'll notice, we have different angles in which we can work. There's 8 of them as we go around this opponent, some of which they can use to defend against. Other ones, it's much harder for them to defend against. In other words, zero depth. In other words, they can't really control what we're doing to them. So if we get in here and we want to send this opponent away because they didn't give us that brace angle, all we need to do is drop the elbow and we can send the opponent off at whatever angle we want. The problem here is glancing angles as opposed to angles of incidence. What we don't want to do is come up here and try and drop this down because we start creating the glancing angle. What we want to do is drop down, creating that angle of incidence. In other words, a nice 90-degree angle to our opponent as we do that strike, as we begin to send them out, send them away on that zero depth zone. So now that we've gone through the general ideas in this technique, let's do a quick, short demonstration of it so that you can see it being executed. Up. Hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system just a little bit better. Thank you very much.